From the very beginning, our marriage was a sanctuary. Sarah and I met when we were barely out of our teens, falling for each other in a way that felt predestined. It was one of those rare stories people dream about, love at first sight, the kind of connection you don't expect but recognize instantly as fate. We built a life together, not a lavish one, but a good one. Every moment felt shared, every joy, every sorrow. We raised 2 kids, now grown with families of their own, leaving us alone in a modest home that always felt a little too quiet after they moved out. Money was always tight, but we managed. I worked as an engineer, and Sarah taught at the local school. Together, we scraped by, finding contentment in simple things, weekend hikes, morning coffee, and the comfort of knowing we were in this together. For 25 years, we were partners in every sense of the word. But life has a way of throwing curveballs you can't see coming. It was during a routine checkup that I heard the word cancer for the first time. Stage 2. The prognosis was bleak but not hopeless. The doctors told me there were treatments, expensive ones, but the thought of draining our already meager savings made me recoil. I couldn't burden Sarah with that kind of debt, not when our life had already been so full of sacrifices. I resolved to live with the time I had, quietly accepting what I believed was inevitable. Sarah, though, was not a woman who accepted defeat. Her insistence that I fight, that I cling to the possibility of recovery, grew louder with every passing day. "We'll find a way," she told me again and again, her voice trembling with determination. But there was no way, not one I could see. I tried to reassure her, to tell her I was at peace, but she would have none of it. Looking back, I should have noticed the subtle changes, the late nights, the nervous energy. At the time, I thought it was just the weight of everything pressing down on her. I never questioned it because Sarah had always been my rock, my unwavering constant. So, I didn't ask when she started spending more time away from home. I didn't ask about the new phone she kept close or the distant look that sometimes clouded her eyes. I didn't ask because I trusted her, completely, without reservation. Sarah became a woman possessed, determined to find a solution where I saw none. While I sank further into a quiet acceptance of my fate, she rallied against it, her resolve sharpening with every passing day. She started taking on extra hours at school, picking up after-school tutoring sessions and weekend workshops. I watched her run herself ragged, a storm of energy and determination, while I sat feeling like an anchor tied to her heels. The truth was, I was tired, bone-deep, soul-deep tired. Cancer wasn't just stealing my body, it was draining my spirit. I felt powerless, and there was something almost peaceful in letting go. But Sarah refused to see it that way. She was a hurricane of arguments and ultimatums, chiding me for what she saw as giving up, begging me to consider every option, even ones that seemed wildly out of reach. "You have to fight," she would say, her voice breaking under the weight of her emotions. "If not for yourself, then for us. For me." I nodded, even though I didn't know how to answer. I didn't want to fight, not when the price felt so insurmountable, not when it would leave her saddled with debt and heartache, regardless of the outcome. I had come to terms with the inevitable, she hadn't. And then, something changed. Subtly at first, but unmistakably. Sarah became quieter, more calculated. She stopped asking me to fight and instead started making vague assurances that things would work out. She wasn't as present at home. Her nightly tutoring sessions stretched later. She began spending weekends out of the house under the guise of preparing for a workshop or helping a friend. I tried not to let it bother me. Sarah was the kind of person who needed to be in motion, and if throwing herself into work helped her cope, I wasn't going to stand in her way. I convinced myself that it was just her way of dealing with the stress of my diagnosis. But there was something in the way she avoided my eyes, how she tensed when I asked how her day had been, that began to gnaw at me. Still, I pushed the doubts aside. After all, we had been through so much together. Sarah was my wife, my partner in everything. I couldn't fathom her hiding anything from me, couldn't imagine her lying to me. Meanwhile, my health began to deteriorate. The doctors had warned me that without treatment, things would progress quickly. The fatigue became constant, an unwelcome companion in every moment of my day. Simple tasks became monumental undertakings. I found myself spending more time in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering how much longer I had. And then, one day, Sarah came home with a small, tightly sealed box. She set it on the counter and told me she had found a way. "Just trust me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. The box contained medication I knew we couldn't afford. She insisted it was a gift from a friend, someone who had heard about our situation and wanted to help. I protested, but Sarah wouldn't hear it. "You're going to take these, and you're going to fight," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. I didn't want to argue with her. I didn't have the energy for it, and in some small part of me, I was relieved. Maybe the universe had finally thrown us a lifeline. Maybe Sarah's relentless determination had worked a miracle. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. The medicine began to work, or at least, I thought it did. It was subtle at first, like the faintest hint of light seeping into a dark room. The fatigue that had weighed me down like an anchor started to lift. I could get out of bed without feeling like my legs would collapse beneath me. My appetite returned, and with it, a sense of clarity that had been missing for weeks. Sarah, for her part, seemed to transform alongside me. The worry etched into her features softened, replaced by a cautious optimism that I hadn't seen in months. She doted on me, ensuring I took my medication every day without fail, preparing my meals, and even coaxing me to take short walks with her around the neighborhood. It felt like a victory, albeit a fragile one. I still didn't know where she had managed to find the funds for the medicine, and every time I brought it up, she brushed me off. "What matters is that you're getting better," she'd say, her tone final, as if the subject wasn't up for discussion. And I was getting better. The doctors were baffled when I went in for a follow-up. The tumor's growth had slowed significantly, and my overall condition was improving beyond their expectations. They didn't press too hard when I mentioned the new medication, though their raised eyebrows told me they were curious. For the first time since my diagnosis, Sarah and I allowed ourselves to hope again. We talked about the future, things we hadn't dared to discuss in months. Retirement plans. Visiting our children more often. Finally taking that road trip along the coast that we had always dreamed about but never had the time or money for. But even as things improved, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Sarah was still leaving the house for long stretches, and though she was more attentive than ever when she was home, there was a distance between us that I couldn't quite name. Late one night, as she lay beside me, I whispered into the quiet, "You've done so much for me, Sarah. I don't know how to thank you." She stirred, her voice heavy with sleep, or maybe something else. "You don't need to thank me," she murmured. "I'd do anything for you." I believed her. How could I not? She had always been the stronger one, the one who held us together when life seemed determined to pull us apart. I told myself that her late nights and evasive answers didn't matter, not when she had given me a second chance at life. Still, doubts lingered. There were moments when I caught her staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between sorrow and resolve. It was as though she was carrying a secret, something heavy that weighed on her even in her happiest moments. I began to piece together small inconsistencies, missing hours, unexplained absences. The medication was another mystery. A gift from a friend, she had said, but she had never mentioned who. I didn't know anyone who could afford such generosity, and Sarah had always been private about her friendships outside of work. Despite my unease, I buried my suspicions. After all, she was saving my life. Whatever lengths she had gone to, whatever secrets she was keeping, I convinced myself they didn't matter. We had built a life together, one filled with love and sacrifices. Sarah had always been my anchor, my constant, the woman who could weather any storm. If she was keeping something from me, it had to be for a good reason. I told myself that trust was the foundation of our marriage, that questioning her would only undermine the love we had shared for so long. And so, I stayed silent, grateful for the second chance she had given me, even as unease settled into the corners of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. But shadows have a way of creeping into the light. And soon, the cracks I had ignored would widen into something impossible to ignore. The unraveling began with something small. A chance conversation, an innocuous question from our daughter during one of her weekend visits. "How's Mom handling everything?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "She's been incredible," I replied. "I don't know how she's managing to juggle it all, work, the house, me. She's even been helping friends on weekends." Our daughter tilted her head, confusion clouding her face. "Helping friends? Mom told me she's been doing professional development workshops every Saturday. She said they were mandatory." The words lingered in the air like a slow-spreading stain. I brushed it off, forcing a smile and changing the subject. But the doubt that had been simmering in the back of my mind flared to life, demanding answers I hadn't dared to seek. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat alone in the quiet of the living room, the glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. My heart felt heavy, weighed down by the questions I couldn't suppress any longer. Where had she been? Who had she been with? And how had she managed to procure medication that cost more than we earned in months? I tried to dismiss the thoughts, to remind myself of her unwavering care and determination to save me. But the gaps in her story refused to be ignored, like a splinter lodged deep under my skin. The following week, Sarah left for another workshop. I watched her drive away, her face calm and composed, but there was a tightness around her mouth that I hadn't noticed before. For the first time in our marriage, I felt the icy grip of mistrust. I decided to follow her. It felt wrong, disloyal, even, but I couldn't silence the voice in my head that insisted I needed to know the truth. Her car led me to the edge of the city, where the neighborhoods grew wealthier and more pristine. I parked a safe distance away as she pulled into the circular driveway of a sprawling estate. The house was enormous, its gleaming windows reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. I waited, my pulse hammering in my ears, as she stepped out of the car. She wasn't carrying her usual bag of teaching materials or dressed in her professional attire. Instead, she wore a simple dress that clung to her in a way that made my stomach churn. She walked to the door, and before she could knock, it opened. A man stood there, tall and impeccably dressed, with a confident ease that spoke of wealth and privilege. He greeted her warmly, his hand lingering on her arm as he guided her inside. I sat frozen in my car, the scene playing out like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Was he a friend? A benefactor? Or something else entirely? I stayed parked there for hours, long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. When she finally emerged, the man walked her to her car, his hand brushing her shoulder in a way that felt too familiar. The truth hit me like a blow to the chest. She was selling herself. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces fit too neatly, the gaps in her story too conveniently filled. The sudden influx of money for my medication. The long absences. The secrecy. My mind reeled as I drove home, the weight of the realization crushing me. Sarah, my Sarah, had been sleeping with other men to save me. She had crossed a line I never thought she would, sacrificing her body and her dignity in an act of desperation. When she came home later that night, she was cheerful, humming softly as she prepared a cup of tea. I watched her from the kitchen table, my stomach in knots, unsure whether to confront her or to stay silent. "How was your workshop?" I finally asked, my voice steady but hollow. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before responding. "Good. Productive." Her lie cut deeper than I expected. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. As she climbed into bed that night, I sat alone in the darkness, my mind churning with emotions I couldn't untangle: betrayal, gratitude, anger, love. The woman I had trusted above all else, the woman I had shared a life with for 25 years, had betrayed me. And yet, she had done it for me. The contradiction was unbearable. The days after my discovery passed in a haze. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the gnawing realization of what Sarah had done. The betrayal burned deep, a wound that felt impossible to heal. Yet, the complexity of it all weighed on me just as heavily. She hadn't betrayed me out of malice or neglect, she had done it to save my life. The question I couldn't answer was whether that made it any better. I tried to keep things normal. I didn't want her to know what I'd uncovered, not yet. But every glance, every word, every touch between us felt different now. I couldn't look at her without seeing the image of her stepping into that man's house, her body becoming a currency for my survival. It wasn't until a week later that the dam broke. I had been holding it in, hoping the answers would somehow come on their own, that I could understand her actions without having to confront her. But the weight was too much to carry. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, looking peaceful in a way that felt jarring against my inner turmoil. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sarah," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, startled. "What is it?" I stepped closer, each word trembling on my tongue before I forced it out. "I know what you've been doing." Her face went pale, the mug slipping from her hands and clattering onto the table. For a long moment, she didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "I followed you," I said, my voice quieter now. "To that house." The silence between us was deafening. Her hands trembled as she reached for a napkin, dabbing at the spilled tea with mechanical precision. "Let me explain," she finally said, her voice breaking. "Explain what?" I asked, anger and heartbreak lacing my words. "That you've been sleeping with strangers to pay for my medication. That you lied to me, over and over again." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stood, crossing the small space between us. "I did it for you," she said, her voice trembling. "You wouldn't fight. You were ready to give up. I couldn't lose you. I couldn't." Her words hit me like a blow, a tidal wave of emotion crashing over me. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the betrayal still too raw. "You should have told me," I said. "You should have let me decide, not gone behind my back and done this." "I couldn't," she cried. "I knew you'd refuse. You'd tell me to stop, that it wasn't worth it. But it was worth it, to me. You're worth it." Her sobs filled the room, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't know how to comfort her. I felt torn between two versions of her, the woman who had sacrificed everything for me and the one who had shattered my trust in the process. In the days that followed, we barely spoke. The house, once filled with laughter and shared memories, became a battlefield of unspoken pain. I wanted to forgive her, to hold on to the love that had carried us through so many storms. But every time I tried, the images of what she had done resurfaced, taunting me. Finally, one evening, I found her sitting on the porch, staring out at the fading sunset. I sat beside her, the silence between us heavy with unsaid words. "I don't know if I can ever truly forgive you," I said quietly. "But I do know that I still love you." She turned to me, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, we talked, really talked. She told me everything, every painful detail, and I listened, even when it hurt to hear. We cried together, letting the weight of the betrayal and sacrifice wash over us like a storm finally breaking. In the weeks that followed, we began to heal, slowly and imperfectly. There were days when the pain felt unbearable, when the shadow of her actions loomed over us. But there were also moments of light, glimpses of the love we had fought so hard to hold on to. Eventually, we decided to leave the place that had become a prison of memories. We packed our bags and set out on the road trip we had always dreamed of, chasing sunsets along the coast and rediscovering the joy of simply being together. It wasn't a perfect ending. Trust takes time to rebuild, and some scars never fully fade. But as we stood together on a cliff overlooking the ocean, the wind whipping around us, I realized that love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. And in that moment, I chose Sarah, just as she had once chosen me.